Welcome everyone to week 3 of COVID class, a liberal arts exploration of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Dr. Taylor Newton.
I'm Dr. Devin Fisher. One of the things that we miss out on with the format that we have is that it's really hard to know how consistent people are here. So we don't know if the participants who were with us tonight were here last week or not, but I hope you were, because I found last week's just to be super interesting. The first week as well. And in a lot of ways, those first 2 sessions really lead nicely up to what we have in store tonight. As a reminder, in week 1, Dr. Catherine Tinklenberg talked with us about Pandemics 101. And then last week, Dr. Daniel Grimm and Dr. Robert Esch talked to us about viruses and how they work. And Dr. Newton, I don't know about you, but that was more than I ever was aware that there was to know about viruses. And I realized this morning, like I don't actually use those terms in my day-to-day life. I don't
talk about capsids all the time. You don't, Dr. Fisher? Nucleic acid? We talk about over breakfast.
Yeah, so no, I don't. But I do talk about the COVID virus a lot. And I think one of the challenges is thinking about how do those of us who don't have that academic vocabulary share information about this stuff? And fortunately, we have tonight with us a couple of experts on this. So maybe you can give a quick introduction before we turn it over to them.
Sure. So we will be following the same format as we have been these last 2 weeks. Our guest professor, Dr. Jeffrey Delbert, is going to speak with us for about 10 minutes. And then he and our very welcome guest, who we will introduce briefly in just a minute, will be answering some questions, and we will invite you also to please participate using the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom screen, as well as the chat feature in the YouTube live stream. We'll be monitoring both of those places for your questions, and we'll bring them in as we are able. Due to time, we might not be able to get to all of the questions, unfortunately, but this session will be made available tomorrow on YouTube, and you will be able to continue the conversation in the chat at that time too.
Before we move to introductions, 2 small business items that I want to touch on. One of the things that I've noticed a couple of times during the webinars is that people have used the raise hand feature. And if we were fortunate enough to be able to just open this wide open for questions, that would be awesome. We would know to give a shout out to you and let you join in with the conversation. Because of the unfortunate world in which we live, where we know that there's always the potential for people to really take over a meeting if we extend that privilege, and by take over, I mean with really hostile, vile stuff. We've seen this in the news about Zoom meetings. We're not able to do that. So if you're raising your hand, if you can go to the Q&A, even if you don't have a question, one or the other of us will see whatever it is that you're needing to communicate to us. Second thing is we continue to learn about communication, and we're going to learn more about communication tonight. But one of the places where our communication has not been as good as we would like is with email. Some of you have reported to me that you're not getting emails. So we are moving to using a program called MailChimp this week, which hopefully will avoid some of the problems we've had with emails getting delayed for significant periods or being undelivered altogether. I probably could use some help from our guest professor tonight on communication, because Dr. Jeffrey Delbert is, in fact, in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Lenoir-Rhyne. He's been here since 2012. He is currently an associate professor, and he teaches courses in argument, digital storytelling, and campaign communication. His research focuses on the intersection of media, politics, and popular culture, exploring how rhetoric influences the public sphere. He has recently been published in a number of places, including Speaker and Gavel, Relevant Rhetoric, the Prager Handbook of Political Communication, and is fortunate enough to have a book forthcoming that is titled The Bullshit Pulpit, Rhetoric and Governance Under Trump. Dr. Delbert advises our campus radio station, WLRZ, and teaches students how to use the radio and podcasts to disseminate messages clearly. So we're looking forward to hearing from him. We also liked our guest format last week with Dr. Ash so well that we thought we would invite another guest. And our guest tonight is a good friend of mine from, how long ago was it that you started at Lenore Rhine, Dr. Reddy? We go back 6-7 years. Dr. Supriya Reddy, formerly an assistant professor of public health here at Lenore Rhine, is now at the University of North Georgia as an assistant professor of public health. Her research interests are in the broad area of public health, specifically though the utilization of health behavior theory to examine risky substance abuse behaviors among college students. So I'm sure no one has ever mentioned to you that you probably fortuitously work at a place where you have fertile ground for your research, right? I'm sure no one has ever thought of that before. Look at me. Currently, Dr. Reddy is examining theoretical predictors related to the mixing of alcohol and energy drinks among college undergraduates, and plans to extend her research to other risky college health behaviors. She has also been interested in global health initiatives, which have led her to travel to South Africa and India. And those endeavors involve the implementation of health education efforts related to tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, nutrition, and hand washing techniques. Currently, she is working on combating health misinformation related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope in a few minutes we can hear how she's doing that. I can tell you for sure one way is on social media, where Dr. Reddy has worked tirelessly to combat misinformation. So with all of that said, I will hand things over to Dr. Delbert, who's going to talk with us for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from our panel and also from the audience.
Yeah, unmute myself. Yes. Yes, thank you very much. And I too look forward to Dr. Reddy's questions. So I was looking at your social media earlier, and I think that those are really good messages. And one of the things we'll talk about today is just listening to experts, or how do we even figure out how to get to an expert that might be credible? Because I mean, as I mentioned during the mini talk I put out earlier, I mean, we're awash in information. And I've been going through this week to look at different programs that we might all be able to use when we're actually trying to find things out. I'm just switching here. So again, I think that this is important to talk about, because I mean, when I'm talking to anybody, and I don't know very much about public health, just that maybe I don't want to catch coronavirus. I don't want my family to catch it. I want my society, my city to be safe. I know that these things are true. I also don't want the economy to tank, and I know that Dr. Reddy has posted some things about this as well. I have no idea in these really niche subjects how to find things out really well, except to follow some particular methods that I think are really helpful. And fortuitously, maybe that's not the right word here, but fortuitously, Maria van Kerkhove had a slip of the tongue or a meaningful statement earlier this week, right? She's the head of the WHO's Emerging Disease and Zoonosis Unit. We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases. They're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And so I listened to, I went through weeks 1 and 2, and I was, I kind of had some semblance of what that might mean in terms of how pandemics spread and how viruses work. And yet, right, she eventually, the whole information is a whole day's worth of just walking back of this claim, right? It's very rare, right? So I don't need to worry about it, right? And we'll talk about what that means, because headlines, which is what most people read when they're going through, maybe you have Apple News or Google News, whatever you might be using, we're just swiping through and getting really, brief information. And you could see right here, I've pulled this from, I think that was from, it's a Reuters story. So it's, from The Wire. Are asymptomatic people spreading the coronavirus? A WHO's official's words spark confusion, debate, right? And so right off the bat, right, we know that the story is going to be salient, that this is important, depending on the news source we'll talk about in a moment, and how they're going to contextualize how we should be concerned as well. And so I like this. There was a study 10 years ago, is who will fact check the fact checkers? I mean, we're awash. Someone had, I think it was in the shared document, Dr. Newton put up a question, right, about, well, can we fact check all the information? That seems improbable. Yeah, probably, right? Because people, we talked about, there's so much information coming out at every given moment. So we know that there are some fact checkers out there. I mentioned a few, PolitiFact, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slide. But when people are fact checking fact checkers, what they're looking at in some ways is aspects of misinformation or information that is incorrectly circulating in the public sphere. You could look at things we'll talk about too in terms of partisan facts. Is this something, are we slanting it, from a particular political perspective, or that might make a difference? Their cultural cognition. What do we know about, like, culturally, how do we want to think about this message? This is important when we're fact checking. There's dueling facts. We'll talk about the way that they're presented. If you're stating a fact positively versus saying that something is not true, there's a different way that you need to fact check that information. And then politicized, that's the worst word, I think, to say out loud, but politicized is what YouTube told me to say out loud. Fact perceptions, right? This is important for us to check as well. But they occur on two grounds, and we're going to go through a couple right here. But we're going to look at how people select particular assertions to fact check, and then how that they go about assessing those selections in general. So on the first is how are they going to, PolitiFact sources 30 to 40% of their assessments based on user submissions. So much like if you're outraged, you're going to send something into PolitiFact to be checked. So over a third of their fact checks, they admit, are just user generated. And then we'll go through their policy right here. I think I can switch. Is this going to work? Can you tell me, Dr. Newton, or Devin, Dr. Fisher, if this has gone to the...
Has not yet.
Okay, let's do this and go back to my face. I'm sorry. And then we'll go to Safari. Okay, so if we go to PolitiFact here, you could look at the way that they actually fact check. They talk to us about how they started, and we can post these. If I would hope we could post these, but politifact.com, they get here about how they choose their fact check, so we can look at that. They consider, is the statement rooted in fact, and is it verifiable? Does the statement seem misleading or sound wrong? Is the statement significant, right? Even there's an assessment right in the selection criteria about what necessarily means significant. Is it getting a majority of news coverage by people, right? So we can see salience playing a role in some of these as well. And then they do a bunch of things in general, right? So they give, each of these sources are going to give us some sort of rating, right? True, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false. And then this one's pants on fire, which is seemingly particularly shareable on, say, Twitter, which is not a place you want to be scrolling through comments. But all of these have different scales that we end up looking at as well. Right? You have something like Snopes as well. You can look through parts. Here they talk about their methodology. They're trying to connect the source of the claim and elaborating on the information, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's factcheck.org. Apparently that went back to the end. What I did want to talk about is this one here, and I've been using this for the past 2 weeks for a number of different issues. We're just talking about coronavirus here, but I have a couple of screenshots of this later on, but they're scouring all news sources, and we'll talk about the way that they're talking about the leaning of the newspaper, when that they posted a news story, and then you can compare the headlines and how they worded them as well. But in all of these instances, it's important for us to think about how this fact checker is even working. If we just go to one fact checker, we're even introducing more. It's very complicated. So can we fact check all the information? Again, was the question that I received. Well, we could, but all of that methodology needs to be laid out, and then it would need to be run through probably other people to make sure that fact checker was good, which could be a Facebook or a Dr. Reddy or something else. But again, these things end up complicating the nature of how do we make sure that the information that we're receiving and that we're using for debate is usable in any particular way. In 2015, Marietta, Barker, and Bowser did a discussion about the rise of fact checkers on the internet. And so they didn't really want to examine partisan claims. So we're going to do some talk about that in just a minute here. Something like Barack Obama built this $16 trillion debt. They would have just assessed the claim. Is there $16 trillion? What is causing the $16 trillion debt? So they evaluated the phenomena were real, and then they evaluated statements of the phenomena that weren't real. And so, they, in their research, examining people like, PolitiFact, and found that 30–40% of each of these fact checkers just used user-generated claims. And so a lot of the fact checks that were found there were focused, were selected by users themselves. And so the selection criteria was a little bit funky. It's just if certain groups or certain people were very interested in it, it rose to the top in terms of fact checking. So it wasn't necessarily fact checking all information. There are some things like Snopes, for instance, has done a better job of actually culling through information and getting us more information. And it's really important, I think, to note here that eventually over time, things like PolitiFact or factcheck.org have a huge database where we can compare facts against each other across multiple situations that are similar, so that as pandemics grow, we can fact check the way that people are talking about things, the health information across time, which is important. And I did a lot of that in the beginning of the coronavirus discussion because I was thinking about Ebola and stuff like that. They found that the focus gives people implicit information. So certain people used fact checkers to say that something was important or not important. If it wasn't fact checked, they sort of dismissed that information. They also found here that there was some consistency in the way that in the results that or the ratings that the fact checkers were giving as well. So you can see something like PolitiFact gave a 2.2, which is mostly true, is real. They gave a mostly true to, or anthropogenic climate change is not real. They gave mostly false. So they sort of fell in line with each other. So the results of this study showed that fact checkers, by and large, despite the fact that they were sort of cherry picking and their methods weren't always really good at the selection criteria, the fact checkers themselves were really helpful in helping people understand the news itself. If we go back to the WHO statement, and this is something I pulled on Tuesday, I believe, and you can, it's been updating now. This is a screenshot of the iPad app there. Look, I almost have a full battery. Congrats. You can see what sorts of papers are covering what. So you can see they have categorized each of the papers from their partisanship, right? So we can see something like, there's a lot of center type coverage where there's, maybe more people covering from the right. Now WHO says COVID-19 spread asymptomatic carriers, major unknown. You can read into that. That's my purpose here isn't to tell you what those things mean, but if you click through, you can see all of the timestamps of when people posted, as well as what the headline is and how we might be being guided by just those headlines. Now, the data itself in the body of an article might be the same. Often they're pulled from the same newswire. But studies show that we're not going. I don't know if you are. I don't always go. I'm like, oh, that's crazy, and I read the headline and I'm out too. So I'm terrible. There's too much. There's Netflix to watch, or other things. I'll end with this. I am serious about this, but I just also there's so much out there. Chan, Jones, and Jamieson talk about how can we combat misinformation. And I think that this is important, right? We know that there are fact checkers out there and they were very interested in that. But so they wanted to say, how did fact checkers impact people's actual beliefs when information was out there was wrong? And people who generate arguments supporting misinformation struggle to later question and change their initial attitudes and beliefs. And so if you are, or someone that read a title and you already embed that piece of data in an argument, a larger argument that you already have, before you do more exploration or more digging, it's going to be much more difficult to change your attitudes and beliefs later on. And this is kind of concerning. They also talk about debunking messages, and that they're more effective when people were more likely to counter misinformation I just misread that all the way. More effective when people were more likely to counter-argue the misinformation than when they were not. There's definitely a missing word in there. And they were more successful when they provide information that enables recipients to update the mental model justifying the misinformation. The first part of that is supposed to be that if you are elaborating on misinformation, so for instance, if people say that wearing a mask is not helpful during the pandemic, and I'm not sure which masks, Dr. Reddy can tell us this, which mask is better. But if I am trying to counter that message with a really long bit of information, talking about the wrong information and talking about masks that aren't good, those messages were likely to stick in people's minds, the misinformation, as opposed to giving people a counter framework to work that information into, and so they forget about the wrong information. And people were able to update that information. And there's not all of these studies don't have there's no evidence of backfire effect, right? If you're talking with people and you can introduce factual information grounded in good research, it doesn't necessarily backfire. You don't see it, or sometimes I call it boomerang effect. It doesn't sort of backfire. It makes them more strongly rooted in their previously belief. But they say that, again, just to summarize here, reduce the generation of arguments in line with the information, right? Just talk about the right information. And I know that Dr. Reddy does this, and I'm looking forward to it, right? Don't talk about the misinformation. Talk about the right information. Additionally, do things that create the conditions that facilitate scrutiny and counter-arguing of misinformation. So set yourself up a space, or at least set yourself up as a person to deal with that information. Don't get really mad about it, and just know that this is the information. I'm going to just keep talking about it. Here's the fact checking that I did. I'm not an expert at this maybe, but here is why I found, here's what I found as good information. And that's all I have to say. I know.
Thank you, Dr. Delbert. One of the things that I'm struggling with I do a good bit of research. I'm not a specialist in health by any stretch of the imagination. I'm struggling just with the inability to check everything. So I'm thinking of a situation a couple of days ago, and this goes to Dr. Reddy. I saw you posted a graphic on Facebook, and it was a really helpful graphic. It summarized some stuff very nicely. And one of our mutual friends says, wait a minute, you just posted a graphic from CNN. What gives? And I think your response back was, well, actually, CNN is just borrowing this graphic or this information from the CDC or some other organization. So it feels like there's this constant circulation of information where even the effort to trace it back to an original source is nearly impossible. So how do we as consumers of information and as people who are trying to make sense of a major public health crisis navigate this?
Yeah, I think so. One thing that I do on social media, I'm always trying to figure out, like, if I am going to post a CNN article or whatever the case may be, where are they getting their information from? So is it Johns Hopkins? Is it the CDC? Are those resources that they're relying on really evidence-based? In other words, are those the resources that the public health experts are using as well? If they're not, then I just don't post it because I'm a little bit weary about potentially getting health misinformation out there, and that's really what I don't want to do. I think the other thing that is really important, and I think Dr. Delbert would agree with me as well, is we all have our own biases. I mean, I'm going to have my own biases as a public health professor as well. We all go in with them, but to examine those, and if you have them, be able to really argue those with an educated argument. And if you don't know how to evaluate the literature, whether, because evaluating health information is difficult, and I totally understand that. But if you don't know how to do that, then ask someone. Don't just post like a Dr. McCullough article and tell me that it's true, because chances are that it's not.
I will confess, I have responded to many Facebook friends' comments and posts which PhD in public health told you that? Because I have one who I'm friends with who told me this, and I know her information is better than what you're giving me. So I do think that's a valuable thing as well,
Sure.
as having the resources there. Dr. Delbert, any thoughts that you have on that kind of circularity of information and how we navigate it?
Yeah, well, so one of my favorite studies they do every US political election is where they interview just Democrats and Republicans, and they only have two samples. So we'll use a Bush and Gore. I think that's long enough ago where we could talk about that. So they'll have a statement from George W. Bush, and he'll say like, whatever, X. And then Republicans will read that and they'll go, I love it, obviously. And then they'll have something Gore says, and then the Democrats read and they go, I love it. And then they'll take that same Gore passage, whatever it said, and they'll present it to Republicans, but attribute it to Bush. And they go, you see, what he probably meant here was, and then they'll do the same thing. They'll have Gore. And so our ability to rationalize when we're firmly rooted in those identity politics is overwhelming. And so I think that one of the things that it's important to do is to try to set your identity aside, what you should believe, that those should statements that resound, if you can, and try to engage with the data itself and reason through it. And then see if the identity that you think you have, right, to be open to that information. And you might find that, you know, you still believe what you believe and you can figure out a way for it to work. But I think that it's that the circularity comes from identity-based rationalization in many ways.
And that, you know, that I have done reasonably well so far with not unfriending anyone on Facebook over COVID-19. It's been tough a few times, but you're pointing to, and you're some of the stuff that you asked us to read coming into this talks about what you describe, or what the article describes as the opera effect of people arguing on different sides of this without ever making any progress. There are times when I just want to throw my hands up and say, I give up. I'm not even going to try anymore. And other times when I really do want to engage and try to correct misperceptions. Do y'all have any advice for navigating that without, I mean, I value my friends, but I also want to promote good information. How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the course of this whole pandemic, I've realized that as a public health expert, I'm not going to reach everyone. I'm certainly going to try. That there are going to be those people that want to see what they want to see and whose views are nowhere near those that align with evidence-based practice. And so I tend to not focus my efforts on those people because I've realized that that's just a moot point and it's wasted energy. And there are going to be people that do listen, that kind of have an appreciation for the scientific method and quality scientists. And maybe they're posting, originally posted something ludicrous, like all that stuff that came out about the Bakersfield boys a couple of weeks ago. And then
I must have missed that. Can you help me out here?
Yeah, so there are two physicians out of California, I believe, who kind of had a hidden agenda about different coronavirus treatments that had nothing to do with hydroxychloroquine. It was just kind of new age stuff that wasn't even a part of a clinical trial. And so a lot of people were, it went viral. A lot of people were sharing that. And I'll just be very quick. If I see it on my Facebook feed, to just be like, this is health misinformation. If you want to talk more about that and why, send me a private message. And then if they're engaging in those conversations, then at least they're open to realizing that maybe they were wrong.
You know, there's a question coming in through from the Q&A that's relevant here from Timothy Smith. It seems like a very basic kind of question, but I'm curious for what experts in communication in this area would say. Timothy said, it seems to me as a denominational leader that many people simply don't care about truth or objectivity. They choose the narrative that supports their position, their feelings. And for example, it's from the CDC and the response is the CDC is corrupt and inept and nothing will convince them of otherwise, or fake news, and that's the end of the conversation. So Timothy was wondering, are we assuming in this conversation that truth is a core value, a foundational value for people? Bit of a philosophical question, but is that our starting point? Do we have to, in order to talk to somebody, do we have to agree that the truth is out there, kind of like X-Files style?
Oh my gosh, so what do we do if the answer to that question is, yeah, we are making that assumption and it's a bad one? I mean, how do we proceed from that point?
What's the color of the pill that you're supposed to take in the Matrix? I can't remember.
I mean, I think inherently we have to assume that, right? Like that someone out there, whether it be reputable scientists or all of us that are working together to try to figure out the answers to all of these questions, are going to rely on truth, or in this case, evidence-based practice, to get you the right health messaging and communicate the correct information to you guys. I do understand there's a whole lot of conflicting messaging going on. Part of that is due to the fact that this is new. It's something that we've never seen before. As the information comes in, you know, well, as new findings come in, that information is going to change. And I think some people don't understand that either. They want us to have all of the answers right when they want them, and they really don't understand that science is a process. And so as the numbers are changing, as we're seeing either rises in cases, or in some areas like New Zealand, they're doing great. That curve is completely flat at this point. You know, we've got to get that health messaging across based on what we're seeing and what the data is saying. So I think communicating all of that is really important as well. And I think once people start to realize that, once people realize, even with the CDC messaging that's going to be disseminated now in the next couple of weeks, those COVID-19 reports are going to be public here in a few weeks now. Those reports go through a peer review process too. And so just trying to help people understand that they're not corrupt, they don't have a hidden agenda, they go through the same peer review process as these academic journals do, is important too.
What do you do to follow up on that just a little bit, Dr. Reddy? What do we do with the fact, and Dr. Delbert as well, a lot of the information that we're relying on right now hasn't gone through the peer review process. Yeah. And that actually was one of the problems with what was actually a fairly major controversy a few days ago, right? The study that was published in The Lancet. Yeah. Was that one actually published? Was that peer reviewed? I know we're relying a lot on, I wrote the name of it down somewhere, where doctors and scientists can post things that have not been peer reviewed because they haven't had time yet, but they feel is vital information. Yeah, we've also had some peer reviewed studies that have been retracted.
So the Lancet, that's what happened with the Lancet, that they thought it was such vital information that it needed to just go ahead and be released before the peer review. And then all those findings got retracted because the methodology was flawed, and so were the results. And so that really should have been examined before the messaging even went out there. With the other article in the New England Journal of Medicine that got retracted, it did go through the peer review process. And I think some of this, maybe the peer review process is not as rigorous as it needs to be, because there could just be the pressures of trying to get this information out there. But I would assume that both of the editors for those journals are going to be much more careful now.
Yeah, and it leads to this effect that there's a great article in Bloomberg just today on this, or maybe yesterday, that kind of traces the shifts in science. And it's had the effect, I think, unfortunately, of really calling into question the experience of experts, because I see, well, the so-called experts said this today, and the so-called experts said this yesterday, and they don't add up, and what's going on. I wonder if Dr. Delbert, you might have some thoughts on how would you help us to think about that kind of messaging in the media when we do have to rely on experts, but we also can't rely on the experts because this is the way science gets done. The experts don't know everything.
Sure. I mean, I think that it's definitely apparent, or it's true that expert messaging, or what experts would do and how we can communicate to the public are very diverse. It was on NPR many moons ago on Planet Money. I really liked that program. And they were examining economic policies that they had brought a panel of, I think, 13 or 14 economists together, ranging from far left radicals to, ultra conservatives on the right. And they came up with a plan of 6 ways that the US economy could become stronger immediately. The counterpart to that episode, which is why I listened to it, was they were then trying to fit them into a political narrative that the American public could accept. And they asked politicians about it, and then politicians were like, there's no way I can say that. There's no, like, ending corporate personhood and things like that. I think the same thing is true now. To go back to the question by Timothy Smith.
Yes.
I think that to assume that we're communicating for truth is optimistic, in the sense that when some people talk, so we heard Mnuchin talk about things today about we will not close the economy again because we cannot afford to, right? So whatever facts that he's using, where we talk, like in our scatological book, we communicate for many reasons. And one of them sometimes is for ulterior purposes, right? We want to give people confidence. As the stock market tanks today, I'm communicating about the virus, not for you to know about the coronavirus, and not for you to stay safe, but to give you confidence to shop, to make you go outside, to reelect me for my particular campaign. And some of that is outright lie, which is, really an enemy to the truth. But I would say that things like bullshit are even more hazardous when people are communicating in the form of truth, or there are some form of truths, but as some sort of misleading away from the actual purpose of that speech. There's another reason for why that they're speaking altogether. And it doesn't always, sometimes it's benign, but sometimes it's really helpful, right? When, health risks are made partisan, that is a real issue, because I don't know if I need to do this because I believe this political viewpoint, or if I should do it because it is good for my health. And when I question that, I think it's really difficult to have any conversation in whatever it comes out in the journals, as Dr. Reddy mentioned. It's really hard for me to say that. Like the headline that we were talking about, the WHO one, right? So it's 24% in the center coverage, 34% from the left, and 42% from the right. A headline from the left, which is Salon, right, is, can people without symptoms spread coronavirus? Answering that question has gotten complicated. Right? So some sort of scientific viewpoint, we won't know the answers very quickly. From the right, which is the Gateway pundit, corrupt World Health Organization does 180, now says asymptomatic spread of coronavirus is very rare, right? Using her own words against her. Now, neither of those are true. Untrue rather, but they are very complicated. And if you are only reading those headlines, we have made a really complicated environment for people to wade through. And I know that I don't have the time to read, I think that in the one fact check there were 40 sources. I'm not going to read 40 news stories about the same thing.
I think from a health communication standpoint too, for one, that WHO release was incredibly premature. Secondly, as experts, people that work for the World Health Organization or whatever else, just need to take into account that we can't assume that the general public is going to understand some of these medical terms that are affiliated with the virus. So really, her statement was an issue of semantics. It's this explanation between pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic, but the general public doesn't understand that. So really ensuring that those health messaging, what we're getting across, is presented in a way that is easily digestible for the general public. And I do feel like with the WHO release, they just didn't do that.
Do we not understand it, or do we choose not to understand it, though? Back to the question a few minutes ago. It looked like we had something coming from the audience there just a moment ago.
Sure, yes. Related to what Dr. Delbert was just talking about. So there's this interesting intertwining of health information, which we usually think of as objective, and it's becoming politicized. So Miles from Black Mountain was wondering, should companies like Facebook fact check political / health comments from candidates for office? So things that candidates are saying, should they be run through a more rigorous fact check if they're about health than they might be otherwise? What do you think? I think that maybe Dr. Delbert was talking a little bit more about that one.
So what was it exactly that was?
Yeah, so should Facebook fact check political comments by candidates for office, especially when they're in the context of health claims?
I think, I mean, this is a really important issue that is being hotly debated right now, right? And is the focus of executive orders as well. I think that it's important that our institutions, we can trust the information coming from them. I will say that I don't know a time in American history where that is or has been true. You know, Jefferson bought up a bunch of newspapers to slander Adams. And I mean, so, I mean, in seriousness, right? I mean, there's been a very real, by our leaders, attacks to slander and smear other candidates. I think that because of the longevity of information now, I think that even if you're not doing it at certain points, I think that some fact checks could be tagged to over time. I don't know if it needs to be on that particular site, but if you know that someone is reading those stories or coming across, I do think that the information environment is important. And because we know that people that respond well to good information and correction of misinformation, I think that it's important that there are spaces where maybe it's an opt-in thing if you really want to know, that especially from our leaders, that we know that there are people we can trust.
Gotcha. So important to hold people to a higher standard, you think, when they're speaking from that kind of a platform, and that maybe social media companies do have an ethical obligation to uphold truth, particularly in those cases.
It's complicated though. I mean, in the example of Donald, President Trump, that was on his personal. He has a personal Twitter feed right now, right? So, are you going to start censoring private citizens' account? I mean, are you allowed to have two personas, like your two, handles, right? Is it just official if it's on the White House's Twitter page, or do we take into account everything that someone's done on their private page, and you're not allowed to post there when you're blank, when you're in office? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I mean, that's in terms of our information environment, that's certainly something that we need to set up rules for. And since it's exploded, and eventually we've moved into apps, which are essentially private communication channels where it's like clubbish, it's not necessarily public. We don't have government control over the internet yet. And I think that these are real questions that need to be answered about what sorts of oversight we should have. So again, even though I think that that's true, right, in the Donald Trump example, that was his private @real Donald Trump account. And so should Twitter do that for private citizens? I don't know.
It's a good question. Kind of related to that, Dr. Delbert and Dr. Reddy, I think maybe you would both like to speak to this next question from Mason Seegers, who was talking about people appealing to authority. So this is something that your lecture touched on, posted for this week, Dr. Delbert, that appeals to authority are one way that we tap into perceptions of credibility. So Mason's pointing out that a lot of people tend to use their certifications, their credentials, to further support their claim or their statement. And should we let those certifications or credentials influence whether we believe their claim or their statement? And then kind of implying that people maybe don't always do that in good faith, or are maybe doing that from a falsified credential. So like, I'm a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor, but I could say doctor and people might believe me.
I worked on my kids until they were about 5. You know, like you've got a doctor in the house who can take care of this thing that's making you cry right now. And then they stopped believing it. It was kind of sad.
That is kind of sad, Dr.
Yeah.
But Mason's wondering, is there a way to combat people who use their degrees or jobs as a way to act like an expert in a certain issue where maybe they don't have a right to?
Well, I don't know. Do you want to go first, Dr. Reddy? Or, I mean, my simple answer is when one person speaks out, it's always anecdotal evidence. Even if you've seen something at your particular hospital or your place of employment, there's something. Science is different, right? Where it's tested and it's gone, it's been vetted. So I think that yes, we should listen to experts and we should say things, we should listen to what they have to say and compare it against data that persists across generalized populations.
Yeah, absolutely. I would 100% agree with Dr. Delbert. It's really along the lines of what I was going to say as well. It's interesting because I actually got into a Facebook argument kind of with an individual who is a physician. She's an internist back in my hometown, intelligent, but she is convinced that the pandemic is getting better. So, in that case, she's on the front lines. She's seeing this every day. She's treating COVID-19 patients, but at the same time, she sees what she wants to see. And none of the data suggests that this pandemic is getting better. And so we were going back and forth telling each other that we respectfully disagree with each other. And finally, I just had to leave it. I was like, I'm analyzing some of the data for different states, working with different institutions to analyze all of the data that's coming in through health departments. But, and I asked her, like, where are you developing these conclusions from? And it turns out like she's not using these evidence-based projection models. She's just kind of seeing what she wants to see. And so there's not really much that you can do with people like that. So yeah, always weigh everything against the evidence. There are a lot of MDs that came from reputable institutions that are making conclusions that are completely wacko. So,
pandemic. Are we going to talk about pandemic?
Oh, we can talk about that too. That's fine. And so always weigh that against the real science. And if they conflict, then I wouldn't rely on that source anymore.
Gotcha.
Do you want to talk about pandemic?
Kinda, I think. So maybe falling into that category that you were just talking about, right? So Judy Moskowitz has some fairly impressive credentials.
Yes.
And
well, assuming that those credentials are true, right? So
sure.
I did like so I've been doing Mythbusters, and I know Devin's seen them on my Facebook page kind of ever since this whole thing started. And I use social media to do that. I'll point people to references as they send me private messages. And so, so Judy Moskowitz, or whatever her last name is, the lay public, I don't think, is going to understand the difference between the governmental organizations that Fauci works for versus the one that she worked for. So they're not the same. She never worked for the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. She and Fauci were never colleagues. She wasn't in jail for 5 years. She was in jail for 5 days. But that was due to the fact that someone accidentally sent her a virus sample and she mishandled it and also stole equipment from her lab. And so, you always want to verify everything that somebody is actually saying. She has a hidden agenda now. She's also a very well-known anti-vaxxer. And so, weigh that against what's really true.
So that all makes a lot of sense to me. One thing that I did note about the response to her in the video project as a whole, as well as the other two doctors who ran the urgent care clinic, is that critiques became ad hominem. So they became about the people themselves And I'm curious if there's a way for us to evaluate the claims of experts without talking about the people. In other words, is it possible to separate the people themselves, yes, from the message, and evaluate those two things separately? Because it feels a little icky, maybe, to talk about the characteristics of the people.
I suppose, I guess, when what they're saying is so off the wall, I think that's difficult for me. But Dr. Newton, I totally understand what you're saying.
Dr. Delbert, do you think that you quoted the famous "the media is the massage"? So to a certain extent, is the message the messenger? Can those two things be separated?
I think so. I'm thinking about it in terms, and I've just spent too long, helping write a book with my two co-authors about people that do this to get other agendas through. I would say that I believe ad hominem attacks are wrong. That is something I would say. But sometimes if you need to build a character case to undermine evidence, but if we take that Chan and Jamieson article, it doesn't really suit us well at all to talk about the misinformation or whoever did that, but instead the real information, like just focusing on the positive messaging does a better job of contextualizing and correcting misinformation than it does continuing to dip back into. I've never seen, I pulled up Wikipedia because that's where I go first because it's great, about pandemic.
Oh, I did exactly the same thing, and I love the first line about it, right?
So
which is what? Can you tell us? What does the first line say?
Pandemic is a 26-minute conspiracy theory video first posted to social media on May 4th, 2020, promoting falsehoods and misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know. I mean, it'd be nice to know who writes for Wikipedia sometimes, but that's a really good summary. And I was like, oh. And I think, it doesn't say anything about her at all, but it does list it as a conspiracy theory video. So it does a good job fact checking it there. It says where it was posted. It says when it was posted. So it gives you a lot of contextual information without having to go into, it does go into her and her anti-vaxxing, whatever. It sounds...
Which isn't irrelevant, Dr. Reddy. I totally am with you, a little, right? But yeah.
So Dr. here's what's a thing that I've been thinking about today in preparation for tonight. That Wikipedia page, and I'm really glad you said that because I didn't want to be the one to confess that in the middle of our webinar, I'm jumping over to Wikipedia to look up this information. The source that it cites as the evidence for the conspiracy theory is the New York Times. I even clicked on the footnote and went all the way down to see what they're citing. And it occurred to me this morning that I don't know how to even ask this without just jumping into the polarization piece. So one thing that seems to me to be happening, and I would love to hear your take on it, is that our political agendas get behind these different narratives. And then we push them out there in the news media in a way that makes it all a matter of opinion. So the best example I might be able to give of this would be logging on to, it's a new conservative news network. Is it One America?
One World.
Oh yeah.
One America. Yeah. This morning if you looked at their top stories and if you looked at their world news, you would never know that there is a coronavirus pandemic happening. There was no, the word does not show up. COVID-19 does not show up anywhere on there. And what I see happening in my social media feeds is liberals just make a big deal out of this. Look at how much the New York Times is talking about it. Look at how much MSNBC is talking about it. Our conservative news networks get it right. This is not that big of a deal. See, it's not even on their website. And now it just becomes a matter of even and I will admit some bias on my own part. I don't want to pretend like I'm an unbiased source here. What appears to me to be fairly objective news reporting on something becomes politicized. Simply the fact of having it reported is a liberal thing or a conservative thing, depending on what issue we're talking about.
Well, Liliana Mesa talks about this, and there's a really good YouTube talk where Mason and Barker, is that his last name? I'm blanking exactly. I'm sorry, sir, about his name, but where they're talking about information in general in this, not just misinformation, but disinformation, right? Where we're undermining information, and then that polarized element as well. Are facts political? They don't have to be, right? So, we could use identity or, fact-based sort of polarization where facts, where Petrosic talks about this as issue ownership, where, Republicans might, or all citizens might imagine that taxes are controlled by Republicans, and something like, healthcare is a Democratic issue, or, we see an issue and then eventually we sort it as a Democrat or left or right issue. Again, what we see, the rise of identity-based polarization is I am X, and then I will decide whether I like this or not, right? I am a conservative, I go to OAN, I already know what I'm going to read and how I'm going to respond to it. And those are the issues, like, oh, if X says this, and they believe what I believe, then I believe that too. And there isn't a lot of sorting of those issues. And it also cuts down on the cross-cutting issues as well, is that if I am conservative, if I am liberal, then we don't have any issues that overlap, because I know that conservatives believe this and Republicans believe this, and healthcare isn't a cross-cutting issue, or the coronavirus in our case, right? I don't need to talk about it. I know that's a liberal issue. And if you don't want to get sick, then stay inside, right? Or, okay. So they don't have to be, but they have become, in our current environment, very politicized because we reason by from our identity.
I actually really like the comment that was just made in the Q&A. It's not exactly a question, but Bob Lake points out that one helpful thing can be when very different types of media are reporting on the same thing and there's agreement between them. That might be a clue that we're onto something. Does that theory hold up?
Yeah, to echo, Bob, yes, I do the same. I have about 4 different sources that I'll read, and the Wall Street Journal and the Times are one. Sometimes I read the Post, or sometimes I replace that with the Philadelphia Inquirer, because I'm not exactly sure. I think they're right-leaning, but I think that Ground News, that app, and it's a web app also, it does a great job of just helping you sort through them. And again, I'm not personally, and I'm very invested in journalism and reporting, and I'm not wading through 40 stories to find the issue, but it does a good job at helping you sort them out. And you can find it, the more you use a single platform, you can use it and tailor it to your own issues. I think to echo, or just maybe build on Bob, it's like when the formal newspaper puts out a time, it puts out the newspaper at 6 a.m. or something, so you can get it on the way to work or something. But now we have stories continually rolling out. What Ground News does too is it tells you when that story was posted as well. So in addition, you can see when news organizations are even talking about something. So if I'm OAN and I find out that 18 hours later, or if I'm the Huff Post or whatever, I post something 18 hours after, even if it's that other issue or the other identities issue, it might rise to the level of importance and warrant further exploration of that issue or a fact.
Fantastic. We are at 7:59, so I'm wondering if you and Dr. Reddy might want to have one final word for us, what you would like us to take away in terms of thinking about communication and miscommunication in this crisis.
I'll let Dr. Reddy have the final word. I think that, again, I think I just echo the Chan Jones and Jamieson argument as, try not to focus on the negative information, but really just create conditions that facilitate scrutiny and try to counter misinformation as much as possible. Not just for yourself to get that information, but to be ready to have that environment for yourself, but also others around you. Hey, this is what I found. And those are the optimal conditions to get good information circulating so we can make the best policy decisions for the most Americans.
Yeah, and I would agree with that sentiment as well. And as hard as it is to just separate your own biases from what's being put out there, I always tell students as well, you know, if it's a pretty sensationalized headline, I try to steer clear of some of that stuff. Because I think, you know, some of those headlines are just meant to attract eyes and get people to read those articles, right? So again, to really rely on what evidence-based practice is saying. And if you really don't know how to tease through some of that information, especially all those medical terms and things like that, just ask someone that you feel is trustworthy and they'll explain it to you.
Thank you. I would like to thank both you, Dr. Reddy, and Dr. Delbert for being with us tonight, for giving so generously of your time. I'll remind those of you who are joining us as audience members, that doesn't feel like the right word. We will have materials for next week's sessions posted on Sunday. And I will send an email that hopefully with MailChimp will actually get to where it needs to go. I know one of Dr. Delbert's interests is memes and viral kinds of things. I've been seeing a lot of those about the absurdity of 2020. And if you've been noticing those and have some thoughts on absurdity and this whole thing, next week should be a real treat because we will have Dr. Gary Johnson, the university provost, whose scholarly interests are in the literature of the absurd, and he will be helping us to make sense, to think through how literature and fiction helps us to make sense of the coronavirus pandemic. Dr. Newton, any final thoughts from you?
Sure. There was one more comment that came through the Q&A that was about combating misinformation and then letting it go for the sake of your mental health. Dr. Reddy, we had a conversation before we started, and I think it's consistent with that. So in addition to all of the advice about culling through the good stuff and telling the difference between good information and bad, also remember, take care of yourself and your social relationships in the midst of all this too. Those things are important, as we will find out later in this class when we get around to talking about those issues as well. What does it do to our social connections and what does it do to our mental health?
Thank you all for being here. We look forward to learning more with you next week, and I am going to sign us off now. Have a good evening.